I trusted them completely. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. But at that time, I had absolutely no idea. At that moment, it only felt like my luck had been unusually bad lately. That morning, I was sitting near the window of my small apartment. The Seattle morning was cold and lightly rainy, just like always. There was a mug of coffee in my hand, and my laptop was open in front of me. An email was glowing on the screen. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I slowly opened it. As soon as I read the first line, something inside my chest sank slightly. We regret to inform you that we have chosen another candidate for this position. I took a long breath. Then I closed the laptop. This wasn't the first time, and probably not the last either. For the past few months, the same thing had been happening. I would give interviews with full effort. Everything would go well. People would smile. They would ask questions. Sometimes they would even say, "Your profile is very impressive." At that moment, I would think, this time it's going to work out. But then, a few days later, that same small email would arrive, and everything would end. At first, I considered it normal. This happens to everyone. Finding a job isn't easy. I kept telling myself that. But slowly, a strange restlessness began to settle inside me. Because there was one thing I couldn't understand. Why did everything feel perfect during every interview, but change at the very last moment? Sometimes I would stay awake late at night, just staring at the ceiling, asking myself questions. Is there something wrong with me? Am I not as good as I think I am? I revised my resume many times, fixed my LinkedIn profile, took advice from friends. I even practiced interviews, but the results stayed the same. Hope. And then silence. One day, my friend Hannah said to me, "Emily, maybe you should take a little break. You're taking too much stress." I gave a slight smile, but deep inside I knew this wasn't just stress. Something strange was happening, something for which I couldn't find an answer anywhere. Then one day, something happened that created doubt in my mind for the first time. That interview had been the best interview so far. The HR manager had said in a tone that almost sounded certain, "We'll be contacting you soon." There was confidence in his voice, and his smile seemed genuine too. When I walked out of the building, my steps felt light. After many days, I had finally felt like maybe things would work out this time. But 3 days later, I received a phone call. And that phone call created a question inside me for the first time. A question I had never even thought about before. I stood there holding the phone in my hand for a few seconds. My heart was beating a little faster, and only one thought kept spinning in my mind. If everything had gone so well, then why does everything change at the last moment every single time? And I had absolutely no idea that the answer to this question was about to change my life forever. Be sure to tell in the comments. Have you ever felt like something strange is happening in your life, but you just can't understand the reason? Because what I was about to discover could shake anyone from the inside. I stood there for a while longer in the same place. The phone was still in my hand. The voice from the other side had sounded completely normal, but it had left a question in my mind that kept coming back again and again. Slowly, I put the phone down. A strange silence spread across the room. Light rain was still falling outside the window. I could hear the sound of cars on the street. Everything was normal. But something inside me had changed. In that phone call, one small thing had been said. So small that maybe someone else wouldn't have even noticed it. But my mind got stuck on that one thing. The HR manager had said, "Our interview with you went well, but we received some information later." That's it. That was all. He didn't say much more, but that single line kept circling in my mind. We received some information later. What information? And from where? I opened my laptop again, checked my emails, looked through my LinkedIn messages. Everything seemed normal. There was nothing anywhere that suggested someone was spreading something wrong about me. And yet, there was a slight uneasiness inside me. I tried to convince myself, "Emily, you're overthinking." This happens often. Companies change decisions for many reasons. Sometimes the budget changes. Sometimes another candidate has better experience. That's what I kept telling myself. But the voice inside me didn't quiet down. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. That interview kept replaying in my mind again and again. That room, the HR manager's smile, his confidence. Everything had felt so real. It hadn't felt like they were going to reject me. So, what suddenly changed? The next morning, I made a decision. I thought, if I want an answer, then I have to ask. I wrote a small email to that company. Very simple. I wrote, if possible, could you tell me why I wasn't selected for this position? I want to improve myself for the future. I pressed send, and then the waiting began. For 2 days, there was no reply. I thought maybe they wouldn't respond. Most companies don't. But on the 3rd day in the afternoon, a new email appeared in my inbox. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then slowly opened the email. As soon as I read the first line, my heart started beating a little faster. They had written, Emily, your interview was actually very good. I read the next line, but we later received a phone call. My fingers stopped on the keyboard. A phone call? Whose phone call? And why? There weren't many details in that email. It only said that in that call, some things had been said about me, because of which the company changed their decision. I stared at the screen for a while. Suddenly, many questions started rising in my mind. Who could have called? And why? Several names came to mind. Old colleagues. Maybe a jealous competitor. But the more I thought, the more everything became confusing. Because the truth was, there was no one in my life who would try to ruin my job. At least, that's what I believed. I leaned my head back against the chair, looked at the ceiling, and for the first time, a strange doubt appeared in my mind. If someone really made that call, then who could it be? And an even bigger question, how did they even know about my job interview? At that time, I had absolutely no idea that the answer to this question was hidden very close to my own world. And when I finally discovered that truth, my sense of trust changed forever. Be sure to tell in the comments, if this happened to you, who would you suspect first? Because the next truth was much closer than I had ever imagined. After the phone call ended, I sat quietly for a while. There was a strange silence in the room. The phone lying on the table in front of me had slowly gone still. But inside my mind, the noise of questions was getting louder. We received some information later. The same line, again and again. I took a deep breath. I got up from the chair and walked to the window. The streets of Seattle were visible below. People were busy with their work. Some were in a hurry. Some had coffee in their hands. Some had smiles on their faces. Everyone's life was moving normally. Only my life felt like it was hitting an invisible wall. Again and again. I asked myself a question. If someone really is calling about me, how do they know where I've applied? That was the thing that bothered me the most. Because when I applied for jobs, I told very few people. Sometimes, I told no one at all. I started replaying the past few months in my mind. Where had I applied? Who had I spoken to? Who had I told? But the more I thought, the more everything became confusing. Because there wasn't a single name that I could truly suspect. That night, I stayed awake for a long time. My phone was in my hand. Sometimes I opened LinkedIn, sometimes email. But the truth was, I was searching for answers. And the answers were nowhere. The next morning, I made a small decision. If I wanted to know the truth, I needed to think a little differently. I decided that the next time I applied for a job, I wouldn't tell anyone. No one at all. Not even the people closest to me. A few days later, I saw a new opportunity. A large marketing agency. The office was downtown. I read the job description. It was exactly the kind of work I had the most experience in. Without telling anyone, I applied. That day, I intentionally didn't mention it to anyone. Not to friends. Not to family. It was the first time I had kept my job search completely to myself. 2 days later, I received an email for an interview. A slight smile appeared on my face. But this time, there was a different feeling inside me. As if I had just started a small experiment. If everything went well this time, maybe my suspicion would be wrong. But if the same thing happened again, then it meant something else. The day of the interview arrived. I reached the office. The interview went well. Very well. I answered every question calmly. The atmosphere in the room was light. A few times, everyone even laughed. When the interview ended, the manager said, "We'll be contacting you soon." I nodded, but this time, I wasn't giving myself too much hope. I just wanted to wait and see what happened. The first day passed. No news. The second day passed. Everything normal. On the third day in the afternoon, my phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. I slowly picked up the phone. My heart was beating a little faster. A woman's voice came from the other side. She was from the same company. She began speaking very calmly, and after a few seconds, she said the same line, the line I had now started to fear. "Emily, your interview was very good." I closed my eyes. I already knew what was coming next. And truly, the next line was exactly the same. But we received some information later. Something inside me sank. Now, this wasn't just a coincidence. Something was truly wrong. And now it was clear. There was someone who appeared every single time right after my opportunity. I slowly placed the phone down. The same silence filled the room again. But this time, a new feeling had appeared inside me. Not just confusion, not just sadness, but a cold truth. If someone was doing this again and again, then they knew about every step I was taking. And if they knew everything, then it meant they weren't far from my life. Maybe very close. I gently placed the phone on the table. For a few seconds, I just stood there. The room was silent again, but this silence was different. Before, there had only been confusion. Now suspicion had joined it. I placed my hand on my forehead and sat down on the sofa. The same question kept circling in my mind. If someone finds out about my interviews every single time, then how is this information getting out? Slowly, I started rewinding my memories. Who had I told? Who had I spoken to? I tried to remember every interview from the past few months. The first company, the second company, the third company, almost the same story everywhere. A good interview, hope. Then suddenly, everything changed. And now I already knew that every time someone had called, a slight anxiety began spreading inside me. Because the meaning was clear. There was someone who was getting information about every interview I attended. I picked up my phone and started looking through my contact list. Some old colleagues, some college friends, some professional connections. I looked at each name one by one, but the truth was, there wasn't a single person among them whom I could imagine sabotaging my job. I placed the phone back on the table, then leaned back in the chair. Sometimes, things in life are so strange that the mind simply refuses to accept them. And that's exactly what was happening to me. That evening, I didn't talk to anyone. Not to friends. Not to anyone else. I just stayed quiet and kept thinking. The next morning, my mother called. That was very normal. She called often. I picked up the phone. "Hey, Mom." Her familiar voice came from the other side. She asked, "How are you, Emily?" I replied normally. "I'm fine." We talked for a few minutes about normal things. The weather, home, and small, everyday topics. Then suddenly she asked, "How is your job search going?" I went quiet for a few seconds. That question had started to feel a little heavy now, but I still answered, "I'm trying." She said with gentle concern, "I'm sure you'll find a good job soon." There was genuine concern in her voice, and at that moment, nothing about her words felt strange. I thanked her. Then the conversation ended. After the call ended, I sat there for a while. I don't know why, but after that conversation, a small thought got stuck in my mind. Something very small, but strange. How did my mom know that I was still actively going to interviews? I hadn't talked much about it with her in the past few weeks, and yet, somehow she knew my job search was still going on. I immediately pushed the thought away. It wasn't a big deal. Maybe I had mentioned it casually earlier, or maybe she had just guessed. That's what I told myself. But that night, when I tried to sleep, the same question came back again. If my mom knew, then did someone else know too? And if someone knew, was that the same person making those phone calls every time? I turned to the other side. staring at the dark ceiling of the room. A thought appeared in my mind for the first time. A thought I didn't want to accept immediately, because if that turned out to be true, then it would mean that everything happening in my life was not because of a stranger, but because of someone I had known since childhood. And that thought frightened me the most. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The room lights were off. A faint yellow glow from the street outside the window was falling into the room. I kept staring at the ceiling. The same question kept circling in my mind again and again. If someone really is finding out about my interviews, then how is that information getting out?
And why?
I tried to convince myself several times. Emily, you're probably overthinking. But my heart refused to believe it, because everything that had happened so far didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started doing the same thing I had been doing for the past several months, searching for new jobs, sending new applications. But this time, there was another thought inside me. I wasn't just looking for a job. I was also looking for answers. After a while, I saw a new opening, a small but fast-growing company. The position matched my experience perfectly. I carefully read the job description, then clicked the apply button. But this time, I made a different decision. I didn't tell anyone about this application. No one at all. Days passed, and 3 days later, I received an interview email. A small feeling of happiness appeared inside me. But now that happiness wasn't the same as before. Along with it, there was also caution, as if I were carefully observing something. The interview was scheduled for the next Monday. I arrived at the office on time. The office was small but very clean and organized. Large whiteboards were mounted on the walls. People were working on their laptops. The atmosphere was professional but friendly too. The interview began. First, there was a conversation with HR, then with the team lead. They asked me several practical questions. I answered each one calmly. The atmosphere in the room was light, and this time, I truly felt like everything was going well. About 30 minutes later, the interview ended. The team lead smiled and said, "Emily, it was nice speaking with you." I smiled and thanked him, then walked out of the office. As soon as I stepped out of the building, I took a deep breath. This time, everything felt a little different. Because this time, about my job application, only one person knew.
Me.
I returned home. The day passed normally. I tried to keep myself busy, but the truth was that my attention kept drifting toward my phone. 2 days passed. No news. On the third day in the afternoon, my phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen. My heartbeat got a little faster. I answered the call. A man's voice came from the other side. He was from the same company. He began speaking calmly. "Hi, Emily," I replied softly. "Hi." After a few seconds of conversation, he came to the main point. "Your interview was quite good." A strange nervousness began spreading inside me, because I had heard that sentence before, many times. And then the same thing happened that I had been fearing. He said, "But we received some information later." My fingers suddenly went cold. For a few seconds, I couldn't say anything at all. Now, there was no doubt left. I hadn't told anyone about this interview, not a single person. And yet, someone still found out, and they had made the call. After the call ended, I sat down in the chair. Now, there was only one thought in my mind. If I didn't tell anyone, then how did the information get out? A few seconds later, another possibility appeared in my mind. A possibility that made my heart start beating faster. Could it be that someone is tracking my applications? And if that's true, then it could only mean one thing. There is someone in my life who is watching every attempt I make. I sat completely still for a while. The phone on the table in front of me was silent now, but something inside me was constantly stirring. Until now, I could have dismissed everything as coincidence. But not anymore. Now the situation was clear. I hadn't told anyone about this interview. Not friends. Not any former colleagues. I hadn't even mentioned it on social media. And yet, someone had found out. And they had done the same thing that happened every time. A phone call. Some information. And then, My hope was gone. I got up from the chair and slowly began walking around the room. Sometimes I walked toward the window. Sometimes I returned to the table. Only one thought kept repeating in my mind. If someone is really watching my every move, then who could it be? I opened my contact list again, looked at every single name. Old friends, people from college, employees from my previous company. But the truth was that none of them were people who could find out about my interviews so quickly. Then another question appeared in my mind. Could it be possible that the information is leaking from somewhere else? I opened my laptop, checked my email settings, looked through my LinkedIn account. I even changed my passwords, but there was nothing anywhere that suggested someone was accessing my account. Now my uneasiness began to grow even more, because if the problem wasn't online, then it meant the problem was somewhere else, somewhere very close. That evening, I sat on the sofa for a long time. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching it. Only one question kept moving through my mind. Who would do something like this?
And why?
Slowly, I began replaying the past few months again. Every interview, every rejection, every phone call. I tried to see if there was any pattern. And that's when I remembered a small detail. Something I had never seriously thought about before. Almost every time, whenever I returned from an interview, my mother would call me sometime afterward. Sometimes that same evening. Sometimes the next day. She would talk normally, ask how I was doing, what I was doing, and then suddenly ask, "How is your job search going?" At that time, I never found it strange, because it was a normal question. Any mother could ask her daughter that.
But now,
when I looked back, it felt like maybe it wasn't just a coincidence. I immediately tried to stop that thought. Even thinking about it felt strange. My mom?
No.
That wasn't possible. I told myself, "You're overthinking." But my heart still refused to believe it, because now I had another question. If she somehow knew every time that I had an interview, then where was she getting that information from? I picked up my phone. My mom's name appeared on the screen. My fingers paused there for a few seconds. I thought, should I just ask her directly? But the very next moment, I placed the phone back on the table.
No.
Not yet, because if I asked direct questions right now, I might never find out the truth. And now, I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. I placed the phone back on the table. For a while, I just stood there in the same spot. My heart was beating a little faster. The suspicion that had crossed my mind just a few minutes earlier. I was trying to push it away, but it kept coming back again and again. No, that can't be. I whispered quietly to myself. Why would my mom do something like that? It didn't make any sense. She had always helped me. When I was in college, when I got my first job, she had always wanted me to succeed. So, why would she ruin my chances? I took a deep breath. Maybe I really was overthinking. Sometimes when a person is under a lot of stress, they start seeing suspicion everywhere. Maybe that's what was happening to me too. But at that exact moment, another thought came to my mind. And this time it was so clear that it was difficult to ignore. My mom always asked the same question. Every single time. Exactly the same. Have you had any interviews lately?
Or,
did you get any calls from anywhere? Back then, those questions felt normal to me.
but now,
When I looked back at the past several months, those questions started to feel different. As if she already knew that something had happened. I picked up my phone again. For a few seconds, I just looked at my mom's name on the screen. Then I slowly placed the phone back down.
no.
If I really wanted to know the truth, I couldn't rush things. Over the next 2 days, I thought very carefully. I didn't talk to anyone about this. I focused on just one thing, the pattern. And slowly, a pattern began to appear clearly. After every interview, a phone call would reach the company. And sometime after that, my mom would call me. This was just a suspicion. There was no proof. But now that suspicion had grown strong enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. On the third evening, my phone rang. The same name appeared on the screen.
Mom.
For a few seconds, I stared at the phone. Then I answered the call. "Hey, Emily." Her voice was as gentle as always. I tried to sound normal. "Hi, Mom," she asked. "How was your day?" We talked about normal things for a few minutes. The weather.
Food.
Little everyday topics. Everything felt completely normal. Then suddenly, she asked the same question that she often asked. "So, how is your job search going?" My heart started beating a little faster. I paused for a few seconds to think. Then I replied in a calm voice, "Nothing much right now." There was a short silence on the other side. Then she slowly said, "Oh, I thought maybe you had an interview this week." My fingers tightened around the phone because I hadn't told anyone about the interview this week. Not a single person. I asked very softly, "Why did you think that?" Her voice changed slightly, as if she had quickly adjusted her words. "Oh, I just asked." A few minutes later, the conversation ended. But after the call ended, I kept staring at the phone for a long time. Now the suspicion inside me had become stronger than ever, because what had just happened didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. If my mom somehow knew that I had an interview, then it meant she was getting that information somehow. And if she was getting that information, then only one question remained. Was she the one calling those companies every time? The thought shot through me like electricity. And in that moment, I realized that I might be very close to the truth. Closer than I had ever imagined. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The lights in the room were off, but my mind was completely awake. A faint glow from the city outside the window was falling into the room. I kept staring at the ceiling. Two voices were fighting inside me. One said, "This is just your imagination." The other whispered slowly, "No, something really is wrong." I turned to the other side. The same phone call kept replaying in my mind again and again. My mom's voice. That question. "I thought you had an interview this week." That was the thing that disturbed me the most, because this time, I truly hadn't told anyone. Not a single person. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee, opened my laptop. But today, I wasn't sitting down to search for a job. Today, I was going to do something else. I wanted to look at the truth a little more closely. I intentionally sent another application to a company. It was a medium-sized firm. The position was good and matched my qualifications. I completed the application and then closed my laptop. But this time, there was one difference. I made a promise to myself. I would not talk about this application with anyone, under any circumstances. The day slowly passed. I checked my phone many times. No calls, no emails, everything normal. But inside me, there was a strange anticipation, as if I were waiting for something invisible. On the third day in the afternoon, an email arrived. An interview invitation. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. My heartbeat got a little faster. I took a deep breath and said to myself, "Okay, let's see what happens this time." The interview was scheduled for Friday. The weather was clear that day. I arrived at the office a little early. Sitting in the lobby, I looked around. People were busy with their work. Everything seemed normal, as if there were no problems in the world at all. The interview went well, very well. They spoke with me in detail, about my work, about my thinking, and about my future goals. The atmosphere in the room was positive. When the interview ended, the manager said, "We'll contact you soon." I smiled and nodded, but this time, I wasn't excited. I was just waiting. The evening remained quiet. The next day, too. And on the third afternoon, my phone rang. Again, an unknown number appeared on the screen. For a moment, my heart felt like it stopped beating. I slowly answered the call. A company representative was on the other side. His voice was polite. "Emily, it was nice speaking with you." I closed my eyes. I already knew the next line, and it happened exactly as expected. But we received some information later. Something inside me broke. Now, there was no doubt left. Someone was finding out about my interviews. Every single time. And that person was somehow reaching those companies too. After the call ended, I sat there quietly for a while. My hands had gone cold. But this time, a new thought appeared in my mind. A thought that suddenly filled me with courage. If I wanted the truth, then I needed to go directly to the source. Guessing wouldn't help anymore. Now I needed to talk to someone.
Directly. Clearly.
And without fear. I picked up my phone. The same name appeared on the screen. The one that now made my heart slightly nervous. For a few seconds, I stayed silent. Then I pressed the call button. Because now it was time to ask a question that might finally make everything clear. And maybe bring the most difficult truth of my life to the surface. As I held the phone to my ear, my fingers were trembling slightly. The same name was glowing on the screen.
Mom.
My heart was beating fast. I took a deep breath and waited for the call to connect. The ringing continued for a few seconds on the other side. Then her voice came. "Hey, Emily." Her voice sounded completely normal, just like it always did. I tried to sound normal too. "Hi, Mom." For a moment, both of us were silent. Then she asked the same question she often asked. "Everything okay?" I replied, "Yes, everything's fine." But this time, there was a slight seriousness in my voice. Maybe she sensed it too, because the next moment she asked, "Doesn't sound like everything's okay, what happened?" I stayed quiet for a few seconds. This was the moment. The same question, the one I had been avoiding for days. But now there was no point in avoiding it. I said softly, "Mom, will you tell me something honestly?" There was a brief silence on the other side. Then she said, "Of course, what's going on?" My heart started beating faster. Very slowly I asked, "Have you ever called a company where I applied for a job?" Suddenly, silence filled the other side. So deep that for a moment I thought the call had dropped. I pulled the phone away slightly and looked at the screen. The call was still connected. A few seconds later, her voice returned. But this time it wasn't the same as before. It was softer, heavier. "Emily, why are you asking that?" Now I had nothing left to hide. I said clearly, "Because every time one of my interviews goes well, a company receives a phone call." I took a breath, then added quietly, "And after that, I don't get the job." Silence again on the other side. In my ears, I could only hear my own heartbeat. Then she said very softly, "Emily, I was just trying to help you." My hands suddenly went cold. The air in the room felt like it had stopped for a moment. I asked slowly, "Help?" Now her voice sounded rushed, as if she was trying to explain quickly. "I thought you weren't ready yet. Some companies can be very difficult. I just didn't want you to make a wrong decision in a hurry." For a few seconds, I stayed completely silent. Words were spinning in my mind, but their meaning was hard to process. I asked quietly, "So, you called those companies?" Silence again, and that silence had already become the answer to my question. My eyes moved toward the window. The streets of Seattle were visible below. People were still walking along their paths, as if everything in the world was completely normal. But something inside me had changed, because the suspicion I had been afraid of for days had now become the truth. I said softly, "You know, for months, I kept blaming myself. I thought there was something wrong with me." Her voice came from the other side. "Emily, I didn't mean for that to happen." But now the feeling inside me had changed. There was sadness. There was shock. And strangely, there was also a quiet calm. I held the phone gently in my hand and asked one last question. "Why did you do it?" For a few seconds, there was no response. Then her voice became very quiet, as if she was about to say something that would change everything. For several seconds, there was complete silence on the other end of the phone. Such deep silence that I thought maybe Mom had hung up. But the call was still connected. I was waiting for her answer. My heart was still beating fast. Then finally her voice came, soft, a little tired. "Emily, I just didn't want to lose you." For a few seconds, I didn't understand at all. "Lose me?" She began speaking slowly. "When you told me you were looking for jobs in other cities, I started getting scared. I thought if you found a good job, you would move far away." The phone in my hand suddenly felt heavier. I looked toward the window. Outside, people were walking along the street as usual, as if everything in the world was normal. My mom's voice came again. "You've always been very independent, and maybe I couldn't accept that." I asked quietly, "So, you called the companies?" A moment of silence. Then she answered in a very soft voice. Yes, I told them you weren't reliable. I thought if you couldn't find a job for a while, you would stay here. Something inside me broke. I closed my eyes because now everything was clear. All those interviews, all those hopes, and every time that sudden phone call. For months, I had thought the problem was me. I blamed myself. I changed my resume. I improved my preparation. But the real reason had been something completely different. I said quietly, "Do you know how many times I thought maybe I wasn't good enough?" Her breathing grew heavy on the other side. "Emily, please forgive me." The same silence returned to the room, but this time it felt different. Now, there was no confusion in it. Now there was truth. I took a deep breath and calmly said, "Mom, I'm not angry with you." And that was true. More than anger, I felt sadness, but there was another feeling too.
Clarity.
I continued softly, but now I have to live my life my own way. A few minutes later, the call ended. I placed the phone on the table, then walked to the window. The air in Seattle was cold, but for the first time, I felt lighter inside. That evening, I made a decision. I would start again, but this time, with my confidence. A few weeks later, I found a new job, a place where my work was truly valued. And when I received the offer letter, I said one thing to myself. Sometimes the hardest battle in life is not with a stranger, but with the people we expect the most from. If this story touched you in some way, then like the video, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to share it with your friends. And tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a situation where trust and truth stood face to face? Because sometimes the biggest lessons come from exactly there.